In this video, we are going to talk about the index properties of the soil. That's since it's going to be the first index properties we are going to talk about. That's the index properties one. Now, when we say index properties, what we mean is that we are talking about the properties of the soil that indicate the type and condition of the soil. So every soil sample has several properties, several unique properties that aids in the identification and engineering of the soil. So when we talk about the index properties, they are simply those individual properties, those properties that aid in the classification of the soil as well as the engineering of the soil. Now, this index properties we are talking about can be related to the structural properties of the soil. They can be related to the structural properties of the soil. Some of these structural properties of the soil include the strength and compressibility. Strength and compressibility. That's the ability of the soil to resist stresses being imposed on it. Another structural property is the tendency of the soil to swell and shrink. So tendency to swell and shrink, that's when it gains and loses water respectively. Then again, another structural property is permeability, the permeability of the soil. That's the ability of the soil to allow flows to pass through it. So now, any property that will aid in determining the type and the condition of the soil, that's the state at which the soil is being found in, or what type of soil it is. So when you use those properties to do such a thing, then those properties are called index properties. Soil may have several properties, but there are certain properties that are unique in classification, that are unique in identifying the type, that are unique in identifying the condition in which the soil is being found. So those properties are what we call index properties. The keyword in here is index properties. The index properties of a soil can be grouped or can be classified into two main components. We can classify the index property as soil grain properties, and soil aggregate properties. Soil aggregate properties. Now let's talk about the soil grain properties. So the soil grain properties, they are the individual grains, the properties of the individual grains or the individual particles. Properties of the individual grains. Or particles. Bear in mind that if you have a whole soil sample, they consist of grains. These individual grains makes up the whole soil sample. So under soil grain properties, which is one classification of index properties, our concern is based on the properties of the grains themselves, the individual grains, without reference to the how they are arranged. So without reference to how the particles are arranged in the soil mass. So although we are concerned about the properties of the individual grains, we do not consider how those particles are arranged in the whole soil mass. And these particular index properties, that the soil grain properties, are used for identification purposes. So used for identification, mainly for identification. What are some of the properties we can consider under soil grain properties? So under soil grain properties, we can have a property like the grain size of the soil, talking about whether the soil is a pebble, is a cobble, it's, whether it's clay size, whether it's sand size, soil size. Just talk about the size of the soil grains without reference to how it's arranged. We can also as well have the specific gravity of the soil. Again, we can have the mineralogical composition. So in dealing with the mineralogical composition as well, we are looking at the soil grain. We are talking about the soil grain. irrespective of how they are arranged in the soil. Now, when when talking about the soil aggregate properties, the soil aggregate properties, we are looking at the mass, the whole mass of the soil. So the properties of the whole mass of the soil, properties of the properties of the soil mass, properties of the soil mass as a whole, properties of the soil mass. Bear in mind that the properties of the soil mass represent the collective behavior of the soil. So how the whole soil will behave is dependent on the soil aggregate. So they represent the collective and represents the collective behavior of the soil. Collective behavior of collective behavior of the soil. Now, the soil aggregate properties is a function of stress history. Is a function. So, function of stress history is a function of stress history. Is again a function of the mode of formation of the soil. Mode of formation, as well as the soil structure. What this means is that the soil aggregate properties depends on the stress history of the soil, the mode of formation, that's how the soil was formed, as well as the soil structure of the soil structure. Now, bear in mind that the soil aggregate properties have a greater impact on engineering behaviors of soil, since usually structures are being built or constructed on the soils, that's natural soils or undisturbed soils. So when as geologists or as geotechnical engineers or even civil engineers, you are going to construct several structures on soils, right? Now, the soil as a whole, that the properties of the soil as a whole has effect on the structure you are going to be built. So based on the aggregate of the soil, will let you know the type of structure you can set up or you can put up on that soil. So let's say I have a soil. Let me don't mind my bowl. Let's say I have a soil in this particular bowl, right? The individual grains, which are the dots I've shown in here, those are the individual grains. When I take the individual grains one by one and I study them, those properties of the individual grains is what we classify as the soil grain properties. And when I consider the whole soil mass, so the soil mass as a whole, that's what I'll consider as the soil aggregate properties. Again, the index properties of the soil can be as well grouped into several components. So let's say this is the index property. I can group the index property into what we call the particle size distribution. Particle size distribution. I can as well group it into consistency. Consistency limits. We'll be discussing each and every one of these consistency limits. Under the particle size distribution, I can group the properties into mechanical analysis. And the mechanical analysis deals with the coarse grain soils. Okay, coarse grain soils. Under the same particle size distribution, I can have the hydrometer analysis. Hydrometer analysis. All these things are done in the lab. You can do lab works to identify all these. And the hydrometer analysis is performed on fine-grained soils. Fine-grained soils. And again, under the mechanical analysis, we have methods like the dry method and the wet method. When it comes to the consistency limits, we have the liquid limits, where we'll be doing the liquid limit test. We have the plastic limit, the shrinkage limit. We have what we call the plasticity index, which is performed on fine-grained soils. So all these are tests we'll be taking you through, but they are mainly performed in the lab. When we're grouping the index properties, we grouped the index properties into the particle size distribution, and consistency, the consistency limit. Where under the particle size distribution, we said we have the mechanical analysis. Mechanical analysis performed on coarse grained soils. Coarse grained soils. And again, we said we have the hydrometer analysis. Hydrometer analysis performed on fine grained soils. Performed on fine grained soil. Under the mechanical analysis, we also made mention that we have the dry method and the wet method. So now let's talk about mechanical analysis. Let's talk about the mechanical analysis method. The mechanical analysis method is also called the sieve analysis method. The sieve analysis method. And then on this method we have the wet method and the dry method. Bear in mind that the mechanical analysis method is performed on coarse-grained soils. Coarse-grained soils, that's soils having a diameter greater than 0.075 millimeters. So they have a diameter greater than 0.075 millimeters. If a soil has such size, then we consider it as coarse grain, and we use the mechanical analysis or the sieve. We can use the mechanical analysis or the sieve analysis to classify the soil. In this process, the soil is washed. If the soil is washed, then we are using the wet method. If it's not, if you perform it under dry conditions, then we are using the dry method. So we pass the soil through series of sieves with varying methods. So a sieve is just so I know what that you have seen. It's something circular with apertures in it. These apertures do vary. Their apertures do vary. So we pour the soil. There are series, so many sieves with so so many sieves with varying apertures. The apertures do vary. So you pour the soil at the top of the first sieve, then you agitate it mechanically. So using the machine or by hand. But the whole idea is to agitate the soil. Then the soil goes through the first sieve. So the final ones will then be at the bottom. So it just this and this particular procedure will just group the soils into different sizes. So the finer ones will tend to pass through the first sieve in here. The ones that are finer than the sieve over here will also tend to pass through into the other one. So the whole process is done. But bear in mind that the mechanical analysis method is performed on coarse grained soils. That's soil samples with a diameter greater than 0.075 millimeters. Now with the sieve, we have so many sieves based on the standard. So the sieve designations and aperture is based on a certain standard. We have what we call the BSc designation. BSc designation. So BSc sieve designation. That's the British standard. And we have the ASTM. the ASTM standard as well, which belongs to the ASH2, which belongs to the ASH2. So just as I said, the mechanical analysis fall under the particle size distribution, which is the PSD. Now, in doing this, in performing the PSD analysis, that's under mechanical analysis, we draw what we call the PSD curve. The PSD curve. This curve actually aids in classifying the soil. So it can help us know whether the soil is well graded, poorly graded, whether the soil is sandy, whether the soil is coarse. It actually helps in the classification of the soil. So now basically the PSD curve is simply a plot of percent finer. So a plot of percent finer by weight versus the grain size in millimeters, or let's say the sieve number. So, or sieve number. You can also plot against the sieve number. So that's basically the PSD. So a plot of percent finer by weight versus the grain size in millimeters. So the image on my right is simply shows how the PSD curve looks like. Now, in drawing the PSD curve, that's after performing your mechanical analysis. You will need certain data. So you are going to need the sieve the sieve size. The sieve size should be in millimeters. You also need the mass retained. You need the mass retained. Now you need these two parameters to calculate for your percent finer. Then also you do some analysis in order to be able to draw the PSD curve. So now let's take a lab sample with certain parameters and calculate for do the mechanical. The mechanical analysis have already been done, so we have the values. Let's see how we draw the PSD curve. Now before that, let's talk about the importance of the PSD curve. The PSD curve I just showed you. Let's talk about the importance. So we use the PSD curve in soil classification. That's being able to determine what type of soil it is, whether it's sandy, clay, silty, whether it contains pebble sizes, cobble sizes, boulder sizes, whatever it is. We use the PSD curve in determining this, in classifying the soil. Now, again, it helps in the selection of materials for using embankments, that's highways, railways, rail track bases. What this means is that whenever, as geologists or as geotechnical engineers, even civil engineers, in the construction of embankments, in the construction of railways and other structures, the PSD curve, since the PSD curve is aiding in the soil classification, you'll be able to know the type of soil you are supposed to use for the embankment. Now again, we're using the PSD curve to determine the activity of the soil, that's the activity of clay. In further discussions, we'll talk about what the activity of clay means. That we usually determine the activity of clay with a very simple formula. So we are going to talk about what the activity of clay is. But for now, bear in mind that the PSD curve aids in determining the activity of clay. Now again, it's useful in the design of drainage filters for dams, retaining walls, etc. So when you took the course that's fluid mechanics, you know what a retaining wall is, or even when you study foundation engineering, you know more about retaining walls. So now, based on the PSD curve, we can know how we design our drainage filters, our dams, our retaining walls. Then we can also use to estimate coefficients of permeability of sands. So now let's see how we are going to draw a PSD curve giving parameters or giving